I'd like to talk to you about historicity of IKS. Why historicity? Historicity helps to establish the impact of Indian knowledge systems as well as proper crediting of the innovations of our ancestors. For example, every time we say Aryabhatta had the following innovations, there are enough number of Western scholars who would say he must have copied it from Ptolemy. Or if you say that Indians had, Sushruta had these kind of innovations, people might say it came from Galen or some such thing. How do you counter these things unless you got a historical understanding of Indian knowledge systems? That is what I want to show in this final section. And my methodology is to ask, is there evidence of contact between ancient India and other parts of the world? Because if we say Indian knowledge systems dispersed to the world, we must first show evidence of contact. Then, is there evidence that knowledge is transmitted from India to the other region? Third, is there evidence that that knowledge system was used in the foreign culture? Now, I'm going to show you connections from India to ancient Neo-Babylon, connections from India to Hellenistic, ancient to Hellenistic Egypt, dispersal to Fertile Crescent, Greece connections, Indo-Roman trade, and many, many other connections. First of all, we'd like to show evidence of contact with Sumeria, how trade and climate-induced migrations have existed from 3000 BC to around 500 BCE. We have to first say, is there evidence of internal evidence of trade and seafaring in the Rig Veda itself? And we see that is true. In Rig Veda 1.25.7, it says, for example, he who knows the path of birds flying through the air, abiding the ocean, knows the course of ships. In the old days, people would carry birds with them because when they don't know where the shoreline is, they release a bird, and the bird flies towards the shore. And that's what Rig Veda is talking about over here. In another place, it says, merchants, covetous of gain, crowd the ocean on vessels on a voyage. Clearly showing in Rig Vedic times itself, there are merchant classes who are trading with other cultures and going on ships to do the trade. That is what this Rig Vedic verse is saying. There's another Rig Vedic verse that is talking about 100-oared ship, not 1 oar, 2 oar, but 100-oar ship. That tells you about how big the ships were even in the Rig Vedic times itself. So this is just a small selection, high quality evidence that shows that Indians were indulging in trade and seafaring at an early period of time. Then we know during the Harappa times, from Lothal, we would have ships hugging the coastline and trading with these places in Africa, Dilmun going all the way to where Kassites, Elamites, Babylonians were. And we also have land-based trading, Mohenjo-daro, Côte d'Ivoire, Chatugai, and other places, going to all of these places and trading. So clearly, contact has been there with Babylon and beyond for a very ancient period of time. We can look for evidence of impact in the common philosophies. For example, India has got something called Vaisheshika with Pratyaksha and Anumana, external and internal perception from sense objects as well as knowing through the mind, and Anumana, inference, reaching new conclusion and truth from observations and previous truths, applying reason. We are seeing similarly, especially in Neo-Babylon, we are seeing that in their epistemology, imagination is the process of clarifying randomness found in nature. In other words, a hypothesis to decide the model out there, and deductive logic, finding logical causal relationship, just like in Vaisheshika, and observation. So we are finding similar kinds of epistemology in the two civilizations, not surprising because we know that there's a lot of trade between Babylon and here. Gopal Stavik, so many commonalities in Shatapatha Brahmana, Mahabharata, and the Babylonian Gilgamesh account, the deities, creation accounts. And in their own accounts, the Sumerian accounts, it says they established their communities in southern Mesopotamia, migrating from the east by sea from the Persian Gulf. The immigrants brought a developed civilization with knowledge of agriculture, metalworks, art of writing to the area, clearly showing that it is from the east that Sumerians were populated, who got their knowledge from the east. It is either the Persians or the Indians, and we know Persians are not organized at that time. It's got to be the Indians who have landed up over here with knowledge systems. And this is a paper that came out in 2022 in Scientific Reports in Nature that is talking about the presence of millets in Sumerian areas. And these are the ones, the red dots are the ones in first millennium, yellow dots are the ones in third millennium. And the proposition is that the oldest millets is in India and coming by maritime route through the Persian Gulf and populating these areas. At least in this paper, we are seeing an echo with their own traditional accounts that migrants from the Persian Gulf, they taught them agriculture and other things. Here is a paper in 2022 taking the evidence for millet and other multi-cropping Mesopotamia that seems to have come from India, agriculture moving out of India in an early period of time. Then we have got in the Indian accounts the Dasarajna, or the Battle of 10 Kings, in which there was a scattering of tribes. There are people, for example, this is by somebody from Twitter who's compiled it in the works from Srikant Thalagiri, who's trying to show these are all the tribes mentioned in Rig Veda who were forced to leave India after their defeat in the Battle of 10 Kings. And they're identifying them with various peoples in Iranian, Albanian, Greek traditions, Armenian connections, the Dahi or the Dacian, these people, Balok, the Patwa, Parsua, Pakhtun, Kiva, Alan, Helen, and other such people, showing, for example, through linguistic analysis, that these are the people who might have come from India and settled these places after they were expelled from India. Jijat Ravi, in his book Rivers of Rig Veda, also using the works of Srikant Thalagiri, he's also trying to point out a similar kind of thing, that after the Battle of 10 Kings, we've had these migrations to the Hittites, to the Greeks, Italic, Celtic, Germanic, Baltic, Slavic people, all over the routes from this part of India. And this accounts for linguistic similarity of Sanskrit along with languages in these areas. It's traced to this out of India movement. We have several evidences of migrations due to natural disasters. We know India suffered a 300-year dry event 8,200 years ago, but we are primarily interested in this 200-year drought that happened approximately 4,200 years ago that led to a collapse of the Indus Valley. 200 years, monsoons had failed in northern India and southern India also, obviously, and this caused people to migrate out. Evidence for this 200-year monsoon failure comes from, for example, this paper in Nature in 2017 that looked at the oxygen isotope, correlating natural oxygen with oxygen-18 isotope to figure out when the dry periods were there, when the wet periods were there, based on half-life of some of these isotopes, some kind of calibration in the lab and such things. And their result shows the dry periods are shown in orange over here, and the wet periods are shown in these downward blue arrows, and they're showing between 2000 BC and so on, India underwent one of the driest periods ever. So this is again a validation of the 200-year monsoon failure that India suffered, at which time Indians living in this part of the world, they migrated out, went to the Fertile Crescent. What evidence do we have for that? Well, there's one more paper that came in Science in 2019 that is talking about the familiar humped bull. This is the Indian cattle called zebu or Bos indicus. The prevalence of this animal went up to a great extent in northern Iraq, southern Turkey, which is the Mitanni-Hittite area. And they are presuming that this came from the Indus Valley, stimulated by the onset of current geological age 4,200 years ago by a widespread multi-century drought. Clearly, a drought in India has forced Indians to move out and settle wherever water is, and were taking their cattle with them. This Akkadian seal from 2200 BC in a Paris museum, that is also showing the Indian buffalo in that civilization. It is very important for them because Indian cattle were arid adapted animals and they enhanced herd survival in those areas. That is why they preferred these animals. Then we have accounts of the Mitannis, the Hittites, and the Egyptians. This, for example, is a cuneiform tablet that shows Mitanni ruler. His name was Sushruta, so close to Dasharatha. He wrote a letter to the Egyptian pharaoh called Imenhotep in 1350 BCE, invoking so-called Aryan gods, invoking people like Indra, Varuna, Ashwinis, and saying in the name of these deities, he's calling out a peace treaty with them. So clearly showing that in this region, where are the Mitannis? This is the Babylonians, Persian Gulf is over here. The Mitannis were in this area where Kurdish people are today, and Hatti people are over here in Turkey. So this is the domain of these people. Clearly showing that there was a Vedic culture, Sanskritic culture over here. Then among the Mitannis, Hittites and Kassites, we can also see they invoked Indra, Varuna, Ashwinis. When the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep fell ill, Mitanni kings sent a healing statue of Shauka, Ishtar with a lion. This same as Durga, Shitala, the deity of diseases in India. Similar kind of ideologies over here. The Hittites, when they suffered a smallpox, they had healers called Hasawa, who used herbs, roots to cure. Kamru Sepa was a female deity of healing linked with Varuna, and she trapped the diseased demon in a bronze pot, saving lives. A technology from India showing that if you store water overnight in copper pots, bronze pots, you can have a mild antiseptic effect, and that seems to be recounted over here. And some of the oldest Babylonian texts are using methods that are similar to what is there in Atharva Veda, and their treatment based on herbal medicine, spells, and of things of this nature. If you look at Egyptian medicine, the earliest Egyptian medicine is Kahun papyrus, 1800 BCE, 1500 BCE, and so on. And they seem to have similar content that is there in Atharva Veda as well as in Sushruta Samhita and so on, talking about medicine, OB/GYN, pediatrics, and so on. J.F. Royle, who was a colonial historian, he's talking in 1837 in this book. He's saying so many plants and materials from India was in use in Egypt to make their own medicines, hinting that there was knowledge transfer from India into Egypt in this very, very early period of time. We are not surprised because we know when monsoon failure happened in India, people have migrated out. They've also taken their knowledge systems. That is why suddenly we are seeing Indian knowledge in Egypt, Mitannis, Hittites, and so on. This is an interesting picture that came out in Twitter some time back, showing what they call is an Egyptian acrobat in a 3,250-year-old limestone pottery shard. But we don't see this as an acrobat. This is very similar to yoga asana position we follow even today. So very interesting to see that. Then there are more records from Babylon that indicate correspondences. For example, in the work Babylonica, Berosus rather, he recounts 432,000 years from their first king to the 10th king and the Babylonian flood. This number is very interesting because this is the duration of the Kali Yuga. In our Chatur Yuga system, Kali Yuga's duration is 432,000 years, clearly showing some cultural ideas from India are in use here. Additionally, they've also got a number 10,800. This 10,800 is there in Shatapatha Brahmana. It says the number of muhurtas in a year is 10,800. Same number is used in Babylon, and it clearly shows borrowing of knowledge. This is a paper in 2014 that hints that certain skeletons in Mesopotamia were analyzed and seem to have genetic affinity with India. They're hinting that this happened during the trade period when these things would have happened. This is an interesting picture that shows in the island of Crete, the Gnosis Palace. It is recovered and they restored the frescoes on the walls of that palace, and to their amazement they found these langurs, Indian langur monkeys. This animal is endemic to India. What is it doing in Greece in 1600 BCE? Clearly showing that there was trade, cultural and intellectual activity exchange from India into Greece even in this early time frame of 1600 BCE. Then there are many, many Greek stories. Any Greek story that you take, I can show you a parallel story with Indian traditions also. So the Purana stories seem to have a true copy literally in the Greek stories. And I'm saying that that is because the Greeks have borrowed so much of knowledge from India, including Indian stories have been used over there. Then there are historians, for example, in Anacalypsis, Higgins is saying, who are the Indians according to Egyptians? He's saying, according to Eusebius, Indians came from the river Indus and planted themselves to the south of Egypt. from Ethiopia, crossing the Red Sea from Arabia. Herodotus is saying that two Ethiopian nations, one in India, the other in Egypt. He got this information from the Egyptian priests themselves. This other historian, Philostratus, he's saying the gymnosophists of Ethiopia, they are descended from the Brahmins of India. In yet another place, he's saying that Indian ceremonies and other things are imported from India into Egypt. So clearly, 2000 years ago, historians are saying that the Egyptians were composed of Indian people. Indian knowledge has come over here. This too is remembering the migrations of Indians to Egypt at the time when the monsoon failure happened. It's talking about that. Then we go to the period 600 BC to 500 current era, we can talk about knowledge transmission to the Mediterranean people, the Greeks and other such. If you look at the Greek epistemology, the big three are Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates did not leave any writing, but his student, Plato, wrote the works of his teacher. And according to him, there are three sources of knowledge. Knowledge obtained from senses, but he does not consider this as a real knowledge. He says knowledge through the mind or wisdom is the highest degree of knowledge. This is exactly what Vaisheshika is saying. So we are seeing that Vaisheshika's epistemology is the same as the Greek epistemology over here, showing how Indian knowledge has come here. Then we have got documented Greek contacts. For example, Skylax, a Greek, is supposed to have navigated the Indus in 509 BCE. Then Herodotus says that in Xerxes, he was a general in the Persian army who led an army against Greece, also contained a lot of Indians in that particular army. Then we know that several travelers like Pyrrhon, who came with Alexander, Patroclus, many other people had visited India. This is a picture showing the stele in the Persian culture, showing all the people who took part in the Persian army in the battle against Athens in 480 BCE. Among them are the Shaka, the Hindush, the Gandhara. These are all the Indian soldiers who took part in that particular battle. And these are some arrowheads that were recovered from that particular battle in a museum in Athens today. Then we have the famous Library of Alexandria. This was set up in the Mediterranean port city of Alexandria by Ptolemy. The requirement was any merchants who have books with them, they were required to part with it at this Alexandria library, where the books would be copied and the original would be kept in the library and the copy would be returned to these people. So this formed an important conduit for knowledge from India to be transferred to the West, and thinkers like Euclid, Archimedes, Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, Theon, Hypatia, Aristarchus, they all use the resources of this library. So clearly showing their intellectual developments were done with knowledge that is encoded here from India. Then we have the accounts of the Christian writer Clement. In 150 current era, he's saying Plato does not deny he procured all that is excellent in philosophy from the barbarians. Indians were called barbarians from them, who he admits he met in Egypt. Then he says the barbarians honor their lawgivers and teachers, designating them as gods. They think they are basically gods and so on. Then he says that philosophy was cultivated publicly by all the Brahmins, and they were deified by the race of Egyptians. Egyptians basically were worshipping the Brahmins, is what he's saying. Also the Chaldeans, Arabians, and so on. These are all, mind you, written by Clement of Alexandria, who lived nearly 2000 years ago. He's talking about the people who lived at that particular time. And similarly, Alexander in his book on Pythagoras' symbols, he says Pythagoras was a hearer, meaning that Pythagoras had learned from the Brahmins. And similarly, we are seeing several other accounts that are clearly showing the presence of Brahmins in Egypt, teaching the people over there. All this is recorded by Clement of Alexandria, that this knowledge has gone not just to Egypt, it has also gone to Palestine, it's also gone to Greece. That is what he's recording over here. Then we have many Greek historians who got knowledge on India, but Indians don't have any knowledge about the outside world. We are seeing all these people are discussing about India, but Indians don't seem to acknowledge that, meaning that the world wanted to come to India for trading, for knowledge, learning the universities, but Indians had no need to go to the outside world. So they had total ignorance or arrogance. They didn't want to learn about the outside, but outside world seems to want to know about India. Pythagoras. So Albert Burke, A.N. Marlowe, G.R.S. Mead, all Westerners, they seem to maintain that Alexander came to India and he learnt in India. And this paper says he even believed in transmigration, reincarnation. When Pythagoras went back to Greece, he became a vegetarian and people called him a madman because he wouldn't eat meat anymore. He formed a Gurukulam style of school where he was the Acharya in charge and his pupils, bachelor pupils were around him, similar to the Indian Gurukulam style of schools. Same kind of school was borrowed by Socrates, Aristotle, as well as Plato. They all inherited a similar Gurukulam school. Also, he believed, like I said, in reincarnation. All Indian ideas have come by Pythagoras. Democritus is referred to as father of modern science by the Europeans, but he's reported by Cicero as well as Strabos as having visited India. So he seems to have internalized Vaisheshika Sutra of Rishi Kanada, and he is basically expressing the same atomic theories and other things that Vaisheshika has already talked about much earlier. Then we have the Ayurveda, Tridosha system with the Panchamahabhuta system. Hippocrates proposed a similar system over here with yellow bile, blood, phlegm, and others, working with fire, air, water, earth, hot, dry, wet, cold, and all these kind of things. Very, very similar system. And who was Hippocrates? Hippocrates was a student of Democritus. So Democritus visited India, got knowledge. He seems to have taught Hippocrates all these things. At that time, there were also Buddhist transmissions, Indo-Greek contacts. Alexander, who ordered translation of Indian works for his teacher Aristotle, as well as Library of Alexandria, set up for east to west transmission. All this was the ways by which Indian knowledge came from India to the Greeks. In fact, even J.F. Royle, he says, this is a colonial historian, he says most of the materials used for medicines by the Greeks and Romans had come from India from the spice trade. That is how they got their medicines in addition, so according to this. We had talked about this earlier, that trigonometry, although they claim Hipparchus is the father of trigonometry, they only had chord tables. It is in India, in Surya Siddhanta, that we are seeing real trigonometry with right-angled triangles. Aryabhatta continued this work, and so on. Then we know that Indo-Roman trade, this happened between 100 BC to around 400 current era, and there is a port sailor's document called Periplus of Erythraean Sea. This shows how ships would come from Mediterranean lands, berth at Alexandria, cross the land bridge in a caravan, and the Red Sea, Indian ships would be waiting for them, and when the winds are favorable, it would take them to trade in all these Indian ports from Gujarat to Tamil Nadu all the way to Bengal, where they would trade in muslin, silk, and all kinds of things and take them back when the winds are favorable. So this is also a conduit for knowledge transmissions. Recently, in Berenike, in the northern tip of Africa, Egypt, a professor from Poland, he's done some excavations where he's found Kushan era Brahmi, including Buddha vigrahas that have been found in this particular area. Very interesting. The famous Pompeii Lakshmi. This is an ivory statue found in the ruins of Pompeii, 79 current era. We know it came from Shatavahana Empire. It exemplifies Indo-Roman trade relations at this particular time. Then we have got Dioscorides. He was a Greek physician from 50 to 70 current era. He wrote the 5-volume Materia Medica with large number of Indian herbs, drugs, recipes. This was used for 16th centuries in Europe. But the interesting thing is, inside his book, I saw some of these. For example, these are all Indian herbs grown in India. These drugs were in use in Europe, clearly showing a transmission of Indian knowledge to these places. Arikamedu, this is the place in Puducherry, outside Puducherry, which was the port mentioned in Periplus of Erythraean Sea, showing an urban kind of culture even here in ancient times, during which time trade was made with Indo-Roman people at that particular time. This is something that was published recently by the Israel Antiquities Authority. What they did is they looked at the garbage dumps left behind by the traders in the Silk Road in Israel, in Levant, to see what kind of materials were they discarding. And they saw that a lot of swatches of Indian cloth were there. These are clearly showing the workmanship, what kind of workmanship and quality finish there is there. If you were to just look at these things, you might think these are modern Indian cloth, but these are 1300 years old. Even in the overland, we had the Silk Road, informal trade network from Mediterranean lands, European lands, through Central Asia, through India, through China, all the way to Southeast Asia. So even in this informal trade route, we have found that a Boer manuscript, a document on Indian medical knowledge, that was found in Xinjiang province in late 1800s, showing that even Indian knowledge was part of the transmission route over here. Then before Islam even came to Iran, we have got evidence of Iranians, in Persia rather, where Jondi Shapur, that was a place where Indian medicine was practiced, along with Nestorians and Greeks who fled the Christianization, Byzantine kingdom, and they were practicing with Indians in Jondi Shapur. We know that the Persian king Anushirwan or Khosrow I, the first, he sent his physician Bosrio to India to get medical texts. So this is how it looks like, the pre-Islamic academy at Jondi Shapur. The Sassanid emperor, he had set it up and getting scholars from India, China, elsewhere to come and practice over here. And he gave refuge to Greek philosophers, Nestorian Christians who were fleeing religious persecution in the Christian empires. However, after Islamic conquest of Persia, this place fell into decline and is no longer obviously operational. We also know there were Jews in India for a long time. So the Old Testament is talking about the Jews who landed in Indian shores thousands of years ago during King Solomon's time. We also know that when the Romans captured Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 current era, a lot of Jews landed up in Kerala. How did they come to Kerala? Because they were the forefront of trade. So they knew the Indo-Roman trade, that you can go all the way to Kerala. In Kerala, they were given refuge by the kings and they lived there for a long time. A third wave of Jews came during the Spanish Inquisition. During Spanish Inquisition, the 1560s and so on, they were fleeing the persecution and they settled in Cochin and areas like that, again through the trade route. After Israel was formed in 1948, all these white Jews called Pardesis, they all migrated out and they settled in Israel now. But I'm pointing these things out because they also were conduits of knowledge transmission from India to Europe in various periods of time. Then the Nestorians, the Kerala Syrian Church. Nestorians are people who were persecuted in the Byzantine kingdom for their opinions on Christianity. The people said that their views was potentially heretical, and they were condemned as heretical in certain councils, and followers of Nestorius fled to Persia, to Kerala, through the trading route, and they're given sanctuary there. And they became the later Syrian Christians, but they maintained connection to Edessa, the bishops at Edessa, and Indian knowledge was transmitted through them. So we are to talk about what were these places in Syria which were maintaining contacts with the Christians in Kerala. So this was at Antioch, Nisibis, Edessa. There were universities over here, part of the Seleucid Empire, then Parthian Empire. And for a long time, merchants from this area had relations with Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and so on. And their schools picked up a lot of material from Indian theology, philosophy, medicine, and these works were later transmitted to Baghdad and converted to Arabic. We have evidence from the Syrian bishop called Severus Sebakht, who lived in this time frame, 575 to 667 current era. So here he is trying to rebuke the Greeks and Babylonians, because they are very arrogant and proud about their knowledge systems. He's saying, if you know about the Indians, the kind of knowledge systems that they have, the Hindus, he calls them the Hindus, the kind of knowledge system they have, the kind of computations they do with their 9 signs, it is far superior to anything anybody is doing. Clearly showing that Indian knowledge was available in Syria in this time frame, transmitted from Kerala to Syria and to other parts of Europe. Then Armenia had ancient contacts with India. We know that there was an Indian community in Armenia in 5th century BCE. Alexander's army, that included Armenians who knew how to come to India, land route to India. Then historians in Armenia say, in general, Armenians knew the general political geography, social life, economic life of India because they were merchants. If you're a merchant, a businessman, you should know about the subjects you want, the people that you're selling to, and clearly they were making efforts to understand Indians for better trade. And Armenian trader Thomas Khanna, he sought sanctuary in Malabar coast in 780 current era, and his followers today are called the Kanayan Christians in Kerala today. Guidebooks to Indian cities were written in 12th century, and we know that many of their cities became important centers for trade with India. We know in 1688, Armenian merchants, they helped the British find their way to India. Earlier they helped Alexander, now they're helping the British to find their way to India. So clearly, Armenians were at the forefront of taking Indian knowledge, trade, and other things from India to Syria and other places. Next, we'd like to talk about knowledge transfers in medieval, Islamic, colonial, and modern periods. We know that when Sindh was conquered, a lot of Indian works, Sanskrit works, were taken up by the Muslims and taken to Baghdad, where Indian pundits were converted and forced to translate these works into Arabic and Persian. And we know Al-Fazari, he translated Brahmagupta's Brahmasputa Siddhanta, Surya Siddhanta, all these things were transmitted, Sushruta Samhita and Charaka Samhita. All these things were translated into Persian and Arabic and injected into Muslim lands. At that time, the Abbasid Caliphate had India, Afghanistan, Persia, as well as Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, up to southern Spain was under the control of Muslims. So in all these lands, Indian knowledge is injected between 700 to 1000 current era, forming a very important conduit for transmission of Indian knowledge to these parts of the world. We also know the Baghdad House of Wisdom set up by Caliph Harun al-Rashid that was set up to translate Sanskrit works, Greek works, Syriac works into Arabic, and a whole lot of Indian works was transmitted to these places. We are aware of that. And Mongol invasion in 1258, that destroyed the Baghdad House of Wisdom, and most of this knowledge is gone, except those that were rescued by Nasir al-Tusi, who took about 400,000 manuscripts to Azerbaijan. Then we know in India itself, many Muslims took Indian works on scientific works, mathematics, medicine, astronomy. Al-Biruni, he wrote Kitab Tariq al-Hind, translated many works. Tughlaq, he plundered Nagarkot and got a library of 1,300 Sanskrit books, and so on. So many Indian works are taken up by the Muslims. We also know of Dara Shikoh, the unfortunate younger brother of Aurangzeb. He had done Persian translations of Upanishads. Up to 50 works were translated, and it is these Persian translations of Upanishads that helped the French to learn about Vedanta. People like Voltaire and others, they learnt about Vedanta because of French translations of Persian works, thanks to Dara Shikoh. Then we got many people who are praising Indian mathematics in the Arabic tradition. Al-Biruni is one of them. There's Ibn Tamim, Al-Nadim. Many figures are there who seem to have appreciated Indian knowledge. Then we go to medieval Europe through the colonial era when trade and knowledge transmissions took place. We have people like Isidorus of Seville, this rabbi, Leonardo of Pisa, Alexander Deville. All of these people had taken Indian knowledge through the Muslims, and they understood about Indian numerals and how to use Indian numerals. This person, Gerbert of Aurillac in 1000 current era, he had studied Indian works, Indian mathematics, and later he became the Pope Sylvester. He also found an abacus to do calculations the way we can do with Indian place value and things like that. Leonardo Fibonacci, when he was a young boy, he accompanied his father, who had a trading post in Algeria, In Algeria, he learned from the Muslim merchants on how to do Arabic, Hindu-Arabic numeral system, computation, and so on. He came back in 1212 to Europe to write a book of abacus calculation, where he also popularized the Hindu numerals in Europe. So we know that Indian knowledge first went to the Greeks and the Romans and others. It was destroyed when Europe became Christian in 330 current era as pagan knowledge, but some of that Greek knowledge survived and was inherited by the Arabs of the Muslims who were consolidators of that information. Indian knowledge also got destructively by the Muslims from India. All that knowledge was consolidated and injected into Europe in Toledo as well as in Italy in translation schools, which is how Europe got to know about Indian knowledge systems. We also had travelers who went directly from India with this knowledge. All of this knowledge today has come back to us repackaged without citations. So we wonder, how did the world get so fantastic calculations and so on suddenly in the Renaissance period? But we understand it on the basis of our Indian ancestors, the knowledge that has gone to the Greeks, Romans, and inherited by the Muslims, injected into Europe, and come back to India. This is how things have happened. Then we have evidence that in Toledo, so Spain had two portions that time. The Muslim Spain, Cordoba was the capital. Christian side, Toledo was the capital. And we had translation schools over there where Raymond of Toledo led the translation efforts. Gerard of Cremona, we know he translated 87 Arabic texts to Latin at Toledo in math, astronomy, medicine, and so on. So we know a lot of Indian works are also part of this translation. That is how Europe, that was in dark ages after the adoption of Christianity, this is how they started getting rational, logical knowledge from India via the Muslims, via translation schools in Toledo, as well as Sicily, where also translation schools were translating many works, which included Indian works, into Latin. This is an interesting picture that was released by British Library that showed 12th century Britain, the kind of medical practices they followed. When I saw that, it was clear to me that these are all Sushruta's procedures for cataract surgery, hemorrhoid surgery, nasal growth surgery. So we know that Indian knowledge was taken from India by the Muslims in the 7th century, 8th century, translated into Arabic and Persian. From there, injected into Spain and Toledo. 10th, 11th, 12th century, it was translated from Arabic into Latin and diffused to the rest of Western Europe. And 12th century, it has already arrived in Britain, where they're illustrating manuals showing how to do this surgery. So this is basically Sushruta's works that have gone to this area. Then we have also recent history of Western numbers, how Indian numbers gradually diffused to the West. We talked about Gerbert of Aurillac. We talked about Leonardo Fibonacci, who wrote in the margins of here how the Nagari numbers are compared to the Latin numeral numbers, how to do place value calculation. But this did not become popular. Adam Rees, in 1522, he wrote a book explaining positional arithmetic decimal usage, and at that time printing press had just come out. So his book was printed and distributed throughout Europe. Overnight it became a sensation. Overnight Europe got rid of Latin numerals and started using Indian numerals in the 16th century. Here's an example in Britain. In 1556, in this book Castle of Knowledge by Robert Record, it is showing how to cube a number 5541 times 5541 by shift and add, multiply again by 5541 to do shift and add. So this description is there to teach Europeans on how to do multiplication. It was routine in India, but that time teaching them. You can imagine from 1556 going to Newton. Newton comes 100 years later. Europe started from such a poor base, and suddenly they were able to ramp up to the level of Newton. That tells you how much of knowledge was accumulated from India and that used to make this happen. Then we know in 1200s to 1300s, several European travelers, Marco Polo, John, Catalani, and others would come to India and take knowledge with them. 1400s, Nicola di Conti, Alfonsi, Vasco da Gama, Bartholomew Ziegenberg, and others who had come to India to take knowledge. And we know that in addition, Chinese knowledge that was also injected into Florence in 1400s, and gunpowder, navigation, paper, silk, printing, and so on. When the Spanish, when they recovered Spain for Christianity after fighting the Muslims in Reconquista, they set up an inquisition during which they were killing off the Muslims, the Jews, and others. At that time, if anybody had any Muslim work, it was seen as seeking knowledge from Satan, inviting savage retribution, the condemnation of Paris, Roman Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition, all these things. So Renaissance European scholars hid their sources. They would not say we got this knowledge from the Muslims who got their knowledge from Indians. They hid their sources and passed it off as their own original knowledge. Because they don't cite their Indian sources, I call them all as plagiarizing Indian knowledge. Then during colonial era, we had a great amount of knowledge that was transmitted. 1500s, we know the Portuguese came with huge ships, 13 ships, 1500 men, several voyages to India. In their admirals, we also had Portuguese scientists like Pedro Nunes, there's De Castro and others, who also took Indian knowledge back with them. India was an information gold rush by every colonial occupier. Missionaries were at the lead of collecting and translating Indian works. Dutch and Drankubar, they collected many works, people like this Bartholomew Ziegenbalg. In fact, this is a book where it only lists the number of books that he had picked up in India, 100 or 200 page book, the bibliography. The Portuguese in Goa collected works, the French in Tamil Nadu, enormous numbers of works are collected. British collected works from all over India. So Indian knowledge was gathered by so many colonial powers and taken away. And we know some of them, Garcia de Ota, who wrote a book on Ayurveda and translated to Latin. We know Dutch botanist, who in Malabar with Ayurvedic physicians' help, he wrote books on plants and so on. Johann Kronig, who was a pupil of Carl Linnaeus, the botanist, he's showing again transmission of knowledge, and Ziegenbalg and several others. So we have evidence of many, many colonial people who are utilizing Indian works, Indian knowledge, and taking it with them. Yukti Bhasha, this is a Malayalam compendium of works of Madhava, Nilakanta Somayaji, Parameshwara, and others. It forms the foundation of calculus, predates Gregory and Newton, contains astronomy, mathematics of infinite series, integral solutions, series expansion, fundamentals of integration, differentiation, and so on. C.K. Raju says these works were transmitted to Europe via Syrian Christian Church 100 years before Newton had proposed this calculus itself, hinting that they copied Indian works, plagiarized it, and developed their own calculus based on this. Not only westwards, also eastwards, India had an impact. Silk Road, Buddhist transmission route through which ideas went to China, to Korea, to Japan, other places. We have had many, many people who came to India to take knowledge. Here's an example in a grave in China 2,500 years ago. They found cannabis. Cannabis is a part of several Indian medications. Cannabis sativa, these are all grown in India and used for Indian medication. It is also there in Eber's Papyrus, that 1550 BC Egyptian book that is talking about Indian drugs over there. Also Dioscorides, the Greek, Roman Greek, he's talking about the same painkiller and such things. Fahian, we know, who traveled to India in this time frame. From China, he walked to India, took the sea route back, took Indian knowledge. Huanzang, who walked all the way to India, all over India, including southern India, went back to China. We know he also took Indian knowledge. Yixing, who came by the sea route to India and went back, was also part of the knowledge transmission route. In addition to Chinese coming to India, we also have Indians who went and settled in China. We forgot about them. In China, they gave them Chinese names, so we don't even know who these people were. But some people we know. For example, Kumarajiva. His father was from Kashmir, mother was a Kushan princess, and he crossed the mountains, went there, and did translation of many Buddhist works into Chinese. Then Bodhidharma, he was a Buddhist monk who was from the Pallava prince. He went all the way to China, taught them even Kung Fu, Shaolin Kung Fu in the monastery. He is known to have been killed in this Hain massacre in 528 current era. Then we have people like Dignaga, who was from perhaps in Kanchipuram, but he settled in China and he translated several works. Vajrabodhi, another person who also from Kanchipuram area, who settled in China. So like this, several Indians also are part of this transmission route. We have today in Guangzhou, for example, a Hindu temple that exists to the present day, showing how there was transmission from India through the sea route all the way to Guangzhou. We had connections where Indian knowledge was going out in the 7th century and maybe earlier. Then we know several Hindu kingdoms there in Southeast Asia from 50 current era, 600 current era, Funan province in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, Vietnam, all these areas were under Hindu influence where Indian knowledge is available, 750 current era to 1279 current era, many kingdoms. So in grand summary, for historicity of Indian knowledge systems, I have presented to you in many timelines and time frames how there was contact between India and other civilizations, how several Indian knowledge systems went out of India, how it impacted those civilizations. This graphic of mine shows you all these things. For example, to Sumeria in 3000 BCE from India through the Persian route, Persian Gulf route, we have had transmission. Then 2000 BC, during monsoon failure, we have Indians settling in Egypt as well as going to Fertile Crescent and other places. Armenians from 400 BCE, we had knowledge of that. Transmission to the Hittites, to the Minoans in 1500 BC, we have knowledge of that. We have talked about the Indo-Roman route, 200 BC to 400 current era. We have talked about the Greek philosophers, 500 BCE to 200 BCE. Then we talked about the Muslim route, where it's gone from India to 700 to 1700 Islamic route. And from here, going into Europe, getting translated in Toledo and injected all over Europe. From Toledo to rest of Europe, Indian knowledge went out there. Then we talked about colonial transmission, 1700 to present time. Eastward transmission to China, to Southeast Asia and other places. So what we can show is every period of time, Indian knowledge has gone out of India to various parts of the world. I have only traced from 3000 BC to present, but even earlier, there are hints of Indian knowledge transmissions. So if you accept the Aryan invasion theory, if you accept the 1500 BCE date, none of this will make sense. But if we remove the constraints of Aryan invasion in 1500 BCE, suddenly with great intellectual freedom, we can reconcile all these facts about Indian trade, Indian knowledge systems with the reality that exists out there. So what have I done in conclusion? I've shown to you prior to 3000 BCE that knowledge transmissions have happened. Harappan trade with Mesopotamia, 2000 BC monsoon failure induced migration to Fertile Crescent, 500 BC to 400 BC Greek travelers Pythagoras, Kyrax, Democritus. After Alexander, contact through 200 BC, Roman trade, periplus of Erythraean Sea, 100 BC to 300 current era, Silk Road, Southeast Asia, China, Central Asia to Mediterranean, medieval trade with Syria, Armenia, Persia and beyond, Arabs, Muslims from 711 current era to Abbasid and to Europe, Muslim transmissions, 1000 current era to 1700s, translations of works to Arabic, Persian, Colonial era 1700 to 1940s, major translations of work to English, German and French, transmission with China to Japan, Korea, pre-Buddhist times via the Silk Road and marine links, and present day transmissions also. So clearly, India has been a source of knowledge for the rest of the world for the longest time in any period of time, any geography, we can show that. So my concluding remarks, I have shown in this series of lectures that Indian deep history taught in schools and universities is utterly wrong. In fact, these are criminal distortions. I've shown that 5 agencies have enforced their ideologies and frameworks, controlling historiography of India: the colonial, Eurocentric, missionary, socialist academia, and Marxist. I've shown strong evidence to uphold the antiquity of the Indian civilization. We have seen well-developed epistemology showing great antiquity in India, well-developed mathematics, well-developed astronomy, roots of knowledge systems with sources in India. We have shown how Indian knowledge systems seeded the ancient to modern world, whether Mesopotamia, Sumeria, Anatolia, in Egypt, Babylon, Indo-Greek, Indo-Roman, Indo-Syrian, Muslim period, common period, colonial period to present, as well as to the East. And this unacknowledged history needs urgent revision. I hope that with my series of talks here, I've been able to cast light on this unspoken part of Indian history, and I hope you as a listener will benefit from this. Thank you very much.